Have you noticed over the years since the invention of cell phones, we really don't really have a lot of conversations anymore? We're more into texting for the most part, or, we just kind of, in a sense, void conversations. But we don't do that here when Black Men Talk. We believe in sincere, heartfelt, strong conversations. Here inside LA's Law, I'm Mark Ellie. Appreciate you giving us an ear. And as you know, from time to time, we do a segment called Up from the Ashes. And realistically, Up from the Ashes is basically someone tells a story of their life. And as they're telling the story and they're walking us through it, we realize and see how God is moving them through their whole life, the journey of life. Therefore, we're giving glorification to God for doing such. And that's basically the theory behind Up from the Ashes. We are all created in a special, distinct manner, individually and exclusively created by God. The breath of life, turning dust into a living soul. God's life-giving presence, the human spirit, the essential, sustaining, and the spiritual element of life. Think about the breath of life. Oxygen, something we use daily. We get up in the morning and we're taking it in, not giving much thought to it. I want to bring in a gentleman that you can spend a short period of time just listening to him. When you first meet him, or basically if you hear him on the phone, and you realize this gentleman has awesome character. Mr. Justin, how you feeling?
Mark, good evening. I'm feeling pretty well. I'm feeling good. I'm doing well. I feel stressed but blessed, as they say.
Okay. Stress but blessed. There it is. I thank you in advance, and I thank you after for, stepping in and into this segment because interesting enough, we all have stories, but from time to time, some of us are afraid or reluctant to share. And I always believe when we share, we'd open up. We don't know who we're touching because anything we have went through, you can magnify that or multiply it by many times. And someone else has went through the same thing, many others. But a lot of times when we're going through things in life, we kind of feel like it's exclusively just for us. No one else is going through it. But when we open up and we start to really talk and share, we realize that's not the case. So with that being said, thank you for being here. And I'm going to bring you back to when you were just a little child. Let's go back to your childhood. We start there. We'll work
Okay.
our way up.
Absolutely. So, yeah, there's a decent amount to tell. So, originally, of note, my father, my biological father, he did pass before I was born. He was, and I'm learning more about him. Obviously, I never met him, him dying before I was born and whatnot. But I've learned a lot about him over the years. He was a really big, gregarious guy, life of the party. Um, compassionate, handsome, well-spoken, a gifted writer, athlete, actor. Like he did plays. I know. College, but I know he did go to UConn, but he did something like not Broadway, big Broadway on New York. It was like a much smaller production, but he played Stanley from A Streetcar Named Desire. Great play from the 50s that dealt with a lot of taboo topics at the time. Uh, Female empowerment, abuse, love, mental illness, a lot of different things going on. And that role was originally, when that play was turned into a film, Marlon Brando played the lead. So I just given that background. So, my dad was a talented guy. Unfortunately, he had a lot of inner demons, and he developed a serious heroin addiction in his later 20s. This is probably, I'm going into probably late 70s, early 80s. The whole opioid epidemic now, we see kids, I work in the field, which I get to. We see kids as young as 14 that are already using opiates, but that's a newer phenomenon. Back years ago, 30 years ago, it happened like later in life. And my father kind of fit into that, that mold. And so when he met my mother in the early 80s, unbeknownst to him, he had contracted HIV from sharing needles. Now, um, he sobered up when he met my mom. And, my mom is Black and Cherokee, and my father has mostly Italian, but some Jewish bloodline too, but not in faith, not in practicing faith. Um, so, I come from a pretty big biracial family. And so he met my mother, and I know he really fell in love with the really, she's quite a force of nature, and I mean that in the best way. And he so obviously he really got connected with her. He straightened up his act, and he ended up, unfortunately, slowly kind of really deflating spiritually, physically, emotionally, having this illness. In late 84, because see, my parents kept going to doctors, and they had no name for HIV yet. They were calling it at the time some type of pneumonia, because that's usually the infection that proves fatal. Um, you either have a cold constantly and you're just in misery, but the ultimate killer usually with HIV, at least 40 years ago, it was like pneumonia was what was going to get people. And so that they referenced, one doctor they went to in New York said, in Chicago, and he named all the big cities, LA, New York, we are seeing this pneumonia, this strange pneumonia. And at the time, I don't think they connected it to drug use. I think it was just based on, they believed HIV was really based on sexual preference, and mostly in homosexual communities. So anyway, um, so they really couldn't shed much light on it, and I was born in December 22nd, 1985. My father died in early August of 1985 at the age of 35. So, he can never outrun his demons. And, he tried, but, so my mom was shattered, and she ended up, she went back to school. That changed the course of her life and the trajectory of her life and what she wanted to do. Both my father and mom were connected by a deep desire to help people. Both of them are very empathetic and loyal people. And I didn't know, this is just all what I've learned about my dad over the years. And I know feel like I've taken on a lot of traits of his. So my mom went back to school. She did the single mom thing, working two jobs, in school full time, doing her master's. My mom is she's a licensed marriage and family therapist. And so she's been in the mental health and addiction field my whole life. Um, I spent a lot of time at grandma's. This was Bridgeport at the time, on the West End, on Colorado Ave. And, I kind of spent a lot of time with my grandma, and I was full of life. I was a kid who I really loved life. I was a happy baby, but I was also rambunctious and stubborn. And it was clear I was not a kid that was going to learn from the mistakes of others. My grandma's nickname for me was Bam Bam, because I was just a tornado.
I like that.
Essentially, Justin, don't, knocking into things like, Justin, don't ride your big wheel down that hill. It's too big. Well, no, I don't. I'm not going to take your word for it. I'm going to see if the hill's too big myself. So it's cute. It's cute when you're a youngster, but it did prove to be prophetic. Just that nickname, just the nature of me, I suppose, at that time, just being young even. And so I was really close with my mom, but she was gone a lot in making this school and work thing happen. So I spent a lot of time with my grandma Mildred. She was awesome. That's my mom's mom. That's my African American and Cherokee side. So she was awesome. I would split time between her and my father's mother. And they would, um, they would, my grandmas, both of them were great. My memories, because I spent so much time with my mom's mom, she was just a character. She was, Parliament 100s, um, Chevis Regal Scotch, cards, cooking, all the smells and aromas from her kitchen, good and bad. You know, the bad is like I can't do chitlins and that stuff, but like most of the soul food I loved. I just loved being next to her and seeing that. And then I'd go spend time. So my father's mother, Helen, how great is this? Her and my mom's mom remained like almost best friends after my father's death. As I was born, of course, I was the apple of both their eyes. So my dad's mom lived in Stamford, so I would go there a lot in the summer. And both women were fairly into the church. My grandma on my dad's side with the Catholic kind of vibe, and then my mom's mom Mildred with the with the Baptist stuff, and both had very different energies. I remember as a kid though, not whether it's the Catholic Church sit, kneel, sit, stand, or the the Baptist Church where the women are fanning themselves and they're about to pass out. I was always I felt something there for sure, but I guess at that age I didn't embrace it, or I wasn't. I would say that my family, especially my mom and later my stepdad, were more spiritual than religious. My mom remarried when I was probably 7, and my stepdad Mark has been has never treated me like I wasn't his. As a matter of fact, the example that he set as a stepdad allowed me years later, when I met my most recent partner, who had 3 kids from a previous marriage, to show up in ways that I didn't know I was capable of doing. And that's solely because of the example he set. Different from my father, though, very quiet from, as I know my father from descriptions. My very deep melodic Mark, they used to call him, a musician, a true artist through and through. Kind of opposite of my mom. They're an interesting kind of mix. And, I do have a sister and brother. We're all 5 years apart. So I'm 5 years older than my sister, but I'm 10 years older than my brother. Step brother and sister technically, but I just call them, bro and sis. And, we butted heads a lot, my stepdad and I, so my father was a hard worker, as was my stepdad, and I saw him do things that I wouldn't. Oh, at this time, so we left Bridgeport. Bridgeport was getting really bad. Well, it was bad in the 80s anyway, but my mom bought a small house in Newtown. So you want to talk about a little bit of a culture shock, even at a young age. Now, I would say that Newtown's like close to Bridgeport. It's not the McMansion. It wasn't the McMansion type of place like Fairfield, like Trumbull, like it is today. Like it's really built up now. I'm going back some years, but it is not diverse by any means. I don't think it really is still, and it certainly wasn't then. So, that was different. That was different for me. Just me having curly hair, kind of just different. I am light skinned. And some of my friends, from the Bridgeport area, I'd get they'd call me Albie Shore and teaser tan and and mellow yellow and all types of, so I'd get this feeling, Mark, of I had a hard time navigating being like too white for my black friends and Hispanic friends, but a little bit too black for my white friends. Now, in my parents' or grandma's house, like you couldn't say the N-word or like sing along with rap songs. I love music, all types. I mean, my parents, from Funkadelic, Earth, Wind and Fire to Marvin Gaye and Otis Redding. I grew up with, all types of just Smokey Robinson, really everything. Of course, the hip hop culture really grabbed me and spoke to me. And I don't know what it is. Maybe that'll come up later in this discussion.
Hmm.
There's something about it. And at that time, that early 90s or mid 90s time, there was something very daring and different. And I felt like that was a part of society that wasn't getting attention. And now some music brings negative attention to things,
Hmm.
and it's not always positive, but I was always fascinated with that. So I
Hey,
had my
Justin,
influence in music.
I
Go ahead.
jump in for a little bit because
Of course.
you I want to go back to you your father that took over after your
Yep.
father passed and your mother married, and you
Yep.
said something I want to kind of zero and focus in on, and I have kind of two questions. You said you bumped heads with him,
Mhm.
and what was his nationality?
So my stepfather's African American also.
Okay.
I think I bumped heads with him more in the sense because, like my father, even though my father was a hard worker, my father was a schemer. Like he would come up with ways to cut corners. Like how can I get the most with doing the little amount, the least amount. And I was someone who like I remember starting to being 13, call just in time landscaping, making up cards and handing them out to people. And and being very entrepreneurial in that way, but being like, you know what? I need more. This isn't enough. Like this isn't enough for me. Like that this paycheck, this thing, like it's not enough. And like, my parents and grandma, they'll pray for things that they'll work out. Things will just work out. I always have what I need, maybe not what I want. And I'm like, how come I can't have what I want and what I need? That was sort of my entitled mindset that I always thought entitlement was just like the Newtown brats that I was around, spoiled with their cars and this and that and everything else. Entitlement has nothing to do with money or prestige. Entitlement is like is it comes from, to me, an overflated view of oneself and a total lack of humility. And I think I struggled with that as a kid and teenager. Let's shifting into teenage years. And I think my stepdad tried to instill that in me. So that's where we butt heads.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. All
Yep.
right. So now in Newtown, you're a teenager and
Yep.
a different environment than
Yep.
Bridgeport, part of Bridgeport. How are you, let's go to how you're adapting to that area.
So I was always like my father, like life of the party. Uh, you know, um, Mark, like my yearbook was like best personality. Like I could, like a chameleon, sometimes in a good way and bad way. Like I could be with everyone. I did, um, you know, the jocks, the stoner kids, um, you know, whoever, the music kids. I was very much like got was very popular. I think that I was, especially like girl wise, most of the girls there at that time, of course, were not mixed. So it was interesting because I would, so I think I was something of a sort of like unique in that way. So I think, I always did good in that department, but I always felt like really a poor kid in a rich town. Because you got to understand, Mark, every cent of every bill had to be counted. Like I didn't have one of those refrigerators that you could just go in and to eat whatever you want. Like most of my white friends um would like, you can go in that you could just eat and whatever. Like every meal was planned, everything, a lot of things had to happen to make that work. Um, my mom also struggled with agoraphobia at different times in her life. It started after my father's death and a real bad car accident she survived. And sometimes her agoraphobia um, would cause her to not be able to leave the house. not in any real distance. So it really impacted her ability to work. There was no Zoom sessions then. A therapist these days could have their whole practice online. You couldn't do that then. You needed to be able to go to your office or drive to whatever rehab you worked at or whatever. So there was a lot of that going on. So there was kind of pressure in the house, and I I adjusted well personally. And then, because I would also go into the city though, Mark. Like I would, like on some weekends, right? I would go into New York into after hours clubs or go up to Hartford or, so like I would enter that world, but I'd also have the suburban safety world. And all the while I was kind of, getting introduced to drugs at various levels. I was playing sports. Um, but when I tell you there's for sure more drugs in the in the suburban schools, I mean, I didn't believe it. I had always heard that, but I mean, it was pretty bad. Like looking back on it too. Um, I just think, boredom, lack of identity, lack of purpose, and money and means, that's a combustible mix. I think, especially at that age where we know now about the teenage brain, it's not developed, especially impulse control wise. So I fell into that. I dabbled with stuff then, and I just kind of went with the flow. But I never really felt comfortable in my own skin in that town, just in that, you know what I mean? Um,
Hmm.
some of these relationships were superficial. Um, but there are people from there that I still talk to this day. So I'm saying, like, there are some people that I met that I've still stayed in contact with, but that was a very weird time for me. The teenage awkwardness in general, and then just um, trying to fit in and just kind of everything going on with my family. So
Yes, it's
interesting time.
absolutely, and it's interesting when you say go to you say when you travel to New York on the weekend, because I noticed back then, you spoke of the '80s, but even probably in this where you was born in the '80s, but around that time, what always amazed me is that you can go if you looked a certain way. You could go in places where you shouldn't be, but they will allow you to be there. It could be
Yes.
clubs, any type of things. Go to
Yep.
New York. I remember when I was younger. I mean, I was in clubs when I shouldn't have been. Realistically, they card you. What is that? They never just basically paid attention to that. So
Yep.
when you said that, it kind of brought me back to that. And yeah, I'm hearing about the environment of Newtown and things that you was going through. You didn't feel um, that you kind of fit in. And that's probably too, when you think about it, as you spoke earlier too, about the teenage part and basically being, just feeling that awkwardness. But to me, it sounds like even though you're doing some things, you're adjusting and you're applying yourself, and you don't have any shyness about you. You're outgoing, you're ambitious, you don't have any shyness. And
Hmm.
I'm listening to all that, and I'm hearing the foundation of a foundation being built realistically. Now, I'm not saying everything we do in our foundation is perfect, but to
Hmm.
where you went about the building that foundation, and even in a sense not feeling comfortable, you didn't retreat, you kept going forward.
Hmm. I did. I did, but very aimless, right? And so when you know, I I was starting to, I was getting by. I feel like, Mark, there's a difference between surviving and living. And I think I was more surviving. Like, I did sports and things, but what kept me from being a great athlete, because the difference between a really good athlete and a great athlete, Mark, is the mental discipline. It's
Hmm.
not the physical gifts. You can be physically disciplined and mentally weak. And when I say mentally weak, I'm talking about letting losses consume you. I'm talking about, having the women next to you that are probably no good. Maybe off season partying too much. But then, like, you could be the hardest worker in the gym. I was the type, like, I lived about, I don't know, 6 miles from the high school. That same mental discipline that after 3 hour, or excuse me, that same physical discipline that after a 3 hour practice would allow me to run home that 6 miles. leave my books for the morning in my locker or whatever and just run home. If you went to take that and said, Justin, if you study for this exam, you'll get a good grade. And the more good grades you'll get, the better future you're likely to have. I didn't have that foresight. Like I was very much impulsive, putting off the things I want most for what I want right now. That was like kind of Justin 101. So yes, I adjusted, I suppose, to the realities and could be pretty resilient people wise, socially, I suppose. But inside my life was my attitudes and my thoughts of myself and my lack of self-worth, true self-esteem, right? Because I think, Mark, a lot of things, a lot of us in life, all of us have worn masks before. And, I think, you can't be all things to all different people. You got to just be yourself. This generation's got it really bad with that, with being able to find themselves. But I struggled with that too, kind of in silence, and I think so substances became that type of numbness to me. It was mostly marijuana at first and drinking, but I did it. I felt like it was social. But I was dabbling with other things. Like I would try other stuff. But at the beginning, I was like, there's certain things I'll never do. You have this moral code, right? I think Mark, I'm sure you could probably relate to this. Part of a person's moral compass is how you're raised.
Mm-hmm.
How much of society do you take into you, society's influence, and the company you keep, like my grandma used to say. You are the company you keep.
Absolutely.
That was one of her favorite sayings. And, of course, the great biblical saying, pride cometh before the fall. She had that hanging, I think, somewhere. And so she described me perfect. I had a lot of false pride. And, I had a lot of some of the other issues that I discussed. But my moral compass initially had, certain drugs I'll never do. Like I would never do opiates, Mark. In my head, I was like, that killed my father.
Mm-hmm.
I saw, I've seen addicts before and like heroin addicts and stuff. I was like, no way, that's not me. That's not what I want to do. There were certain people, like I was like, I'll never rob this person or do this, because I was starting to get into mischief, like mischief by way of like stealing, like getting involved in beating people and kind of like robbing people to kind of have, buy Jordans that, my parents, I didn't want the Shaq shoes from Kmart. I wanted, you know what I mean? So I would, I'd work the part-time job, but I'd also do these like, all get involved in a lot of that nonsense.
Gotcha.
So that started to take hold, in that 16 to 19 age. And I didn't really know what it was that I wanted to do other than, I had this false hope of marrying my high school sweetheart, who was a very upper middle class girl with a pediatrician mom and a psychiatrist dad. You could imagine those conversations at dinner were interesting. And, we were two lovebirds and I, she was very feisty and I don't think her parents were prejudiced, Mark, to be honest, but I think they saw the coming storm that was me. Okay. And I think that's what alarmed them. I think they liked me, but they tried to pull her away from me. They sent her. And, the more as a parent, the more you try to restrict, the more a child pushes.
Absolutely.
So I remember them sending her to a private school to keep her away from me. And then of course I'd go sneak her out, or she would sneak out and drive and come see me. So I had that going on, and really one directionless mess, just kind of like keeping it together, but still had enough of that disarming charm, as I had a person describe it, to really keep people close to me that were still willing to help me.
I want to zero in on something else again, because you spoke of the narcotics as far as numbing. Yeah. And I've always been under the mindset that, there's recreational things we do to feel a certain way. And I don't think a lot of times we look at people when they're overindulging in narcotics are overindulgent in alcohol, we
Mm-hmm.
don't think that they're running from something. They're numbing something.
Mm-hmm.
And we just assume that, they just choose to overindulge. I want to bring you back to that right there, because I don't think it's when you speak of the moral character, I don't think one just starts out really trying to basically say, this is my goal to be this when it comes to overindulging. But the numbing part of it is what really kind of opens the gateway, the door to even do some of those things. Your reaction to that?
Yeah, yeah. So I I believe that, Mark, essentially, I've always had an unhealthy relationship with anything that makes me feel good. And I believe, this is my opinion, I choose to believe this. Now, this isn't factual. There is genetic components to addiction, right? But I believe, let me just put it in layman's terms, not to speak on to the biology of it, which I'm pretty versed in, but I don't want to speak to that. I think just on the bare bones spiritual level, there are some people who, in the physical human body, do not have an off switch. Essentially, when they touch any one of those things that where like maybe in capital letters maybe a little bit is okay, but too much will kill you. They don't know how to do the little bit. So for me, it was like I remember the first time I drank alcohol, Mark. I was probably like 12. And I've shared this when I go and have speaking engagements, and I'm kind of telling my story. Um, and I remember it was a handle of Bacardi Superior with me and like four others, and it was old and nasty. And I remember we all got really really sick. And I remember, so of that crew, there was five of us who finished that bottle. I remember, it feels like it was yesterday, man. Time flies. Um, I I remember three of the group, three kids in that group, um, were like, you know what? I didn't like that experience. I'm good, or at least like I'm not going to try it. I don't want to do. I have no interest in doing this again, even if they did it years down the line or in adulthood, whatever. It was not on their brain to do it again. Me and this one other individual, it's very telling that we were like, we couldn't wait, Mark, to do it again. We were just like, next time it's going to be different. And I loved that feeling, like that feeling that I got from it. It made me essentially forget about my problems, and it allowed me to be comfortable enough for any moment. And how can one really learn themselves? Your true self is right there. It's buried underneath a lot of mess, society's expectations. Um, Basically, when the world gets its hands on you after childhood, if you're not careful, your true self will get buried under a lot of the weight of a lot of different things. But I think for me, it's clear evidence that I couldn't sit with my true self because I was always looking just to be okay with any moment, to be in some altered state of consciousness. Marijuana, same thing. Um, and there'd be times when like I couldn't get any higher, but I would still like want to keep pushing. There's people like my sister. No, Justin, I've had enough. And she's dabbled here or there. She's a good girl though, through and through. But like, no, Justin, I got to study for a test tomorrow. Or no, I didn't like the experience that I had with it last time. So why would I do something stupid like that again? I just don't think, Mark, that exists naturally in certain people. I don't. I'm not saying it can be learned in certain areas of life, but for me, if we're talking about narcotics and substances and alcohol, which I do consider alcohol to be a drug, um, I will never gain the willpower to control it. That's what I thoroughly believe. I don't care how many years I've been doing well in life, being a productive member of society, etc. I don't believe that I'll ever have that control. I didn't have it then, and I don't think I can just learn to have it. When it comes to drugs, other areas of my life could be a struggle, but I could probably learn. But when it comes to, like you said, the whole narcotic thing, no.
Hey, I appreciate you just sharing that and being, straightforward, honest. That's it, man. I appreciate you taking the time out, of course, to be here. But realistically, man, pull the curtain back and just really showing who you are, showing your insides. And as you're saying that, you just don't think that's possible for you. Let's go back to the with the willpower. Let's go back to the 16-year-old and let's work our way from there. You're being 16.
Mhm.
And ironically, as you were saying about the family, I want to kind of just clear because people are probably listening to understand when we speak of Newtown, you and I are in Connecticut, so we kind of get it. But I'm going to say this before I come back to you. Bridgeport was like, if you I had to kind of give Bridgeport, it's almost like a melting pot, similar to New York. He had a little bit of everything
Yes.
in Bridgeport. In different
Yep.
sections, it was just everything was there. There was nothing totally different. But if you move to Newtown, realistically, you basically are going into just about all Caucasian, all white for the most part.
Oh
Very
yeah.
few of anything else. And
Yep.
I didn't hear you speak where, as you, I know you spoke of her parents, they didn't, in a sense, they didn't look at you from a racist point. But it's just interesting where it seems to me you adapted well in that area at a time when I'm not saying racial stuff was going on, but again, Newtown is predominantly where
hmm
it's just one, it's just one basically color in that sense.
So it's interesting. Yes. And we did experience some interesting stuff. So one night, I remember I was driving my girlfriend the one night, my main girlfriend, like basically you know how those relationships go, but she was
Mm-hmm.
basically my high school love, if you will. And in her car, she had a nice car. I didn't have she was a grade younger than me. Um, and or 2 grades younger than me. No, I think she was 2 grades younger than me. So, um, I, so I picked her. I was driving right now. We had we had smoked marijuana together, but we didn't have it in the car. We rolled. Blunts were the big thing then. And so she looked like real. She was kind of newer to it, I guess. But I was driving, like she kept like taking wrong turns and all that stuff. So, like I was like, listen, we're never gonna get to I can't remember where we were going. So we got pulled over. And long story short, the Newtown cop basically accused me of being her drug dealer.
Hmm.
And she was like not in those words, but like you
Mm-hmm.
could tell by the way he was, how cops essentially interview to survey the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And she was getting particularly feisty because we had nothing in the car, no substances, nothing to hide. Um, so I think she felt free to kind of unload and was really cussing the cop out and all this stuff. Um, and they bought the dog, and I just felt they were really condescending. The officer, and then whoever the other guy is that came patrolled and came on the scene, and accusatory. And I felt this was summertime, right? Her and I had left some party. So at this point, I'm not like kind of in the wintertime, my mom says I get scary. That's her way of saying pale. Um, so this was the summertime. So I had a deep tan going.
Okay.
So, you could tell, and my curls, Mark, you see me only with short hair. My hair gets really kinky and curly when I grow it out. So it was summer and it was like flowing. And so I'm not, who knows what he thought, but clearly he felt the situation was different than it was. So I have to, and listen, it's I will hear people who are just perhaps Caucasian and have never experienced prejudice or being followed in a store or whatever. I'll hear them go, well, like, how did you know they were being like? How can you know that they were being prejudiced? And you just know. It's hard for me to explain. I just know the way they were fishing. It was like, would they be doing this, Mark, if my name was Brad? And I
Not
don't
at
know.
all.
I lived in her neighborhood where
Not
her
at all.
house was,
Yeah, not
and
at all.
Mark, that was probably the problem because that part of Newtown, even then, believe it or not, that section of Sandy Hook, where unfortunately that school shooting had happened some years ago, there is a more working class section over there. That's where I lived. She lived in this area off of Route 25, headed towards Monroe and Trumbull, And so we were about less than 10 minutes from her house when we got pulled over. So I don't know. I think so. I did experience that. I navigated it, but I wanted to touch on that because I
Okay.
don't know. This flashback just came to my mind.
Okay, cool. Cool. So moving on, how do things end with her? Or how things go on longer with her?
She ended up, well, listen, I think the natural progression of those types of relationships is that they die out, right? I think, because she was younger than me. And honestly, I think she wanted more out of life. I was content running around with not a good crew, and I couldn't fathom. So she wanted to end things, but you know how those relationships go. Like she had a boyfriend after, so she was a senior still in high school when I had graduated already. And so we had made that work. And then she had a boyfriend at this private school, but she was still seeing me. Like, we tried to keep that relationship going longer than it should. And of course, it hurt feelings. So I had a deep resentment towards her for a long time. Um, but in my mind, again, that is Mark, some will say, I learned this in recovery. I mean, take it for what it's worth. It's just an opinion that whatever age you start using mind or mood altering substances, that is the age of your emotional maturity. So essentially, I was, operating at like I believe that to be true, by the way. I was operating at the maturity of like a 12-year-old. So I couldn't fathom how she could, do that. And, so she kind of disappeared into her life of college and doing whatever she ended up doing. And then I disappeared into my life of just really no consistency, right? Signing up for classes, doing this, walking on to wrestling team at one of the universities, having different jobs. I could never stay with one thing, Mark, for too long. Not a relationship, not a job, I would always just like, it would get uncomfortable or something would happen and I would move on from it. And, that, that, um, that struggle with consistency opened the door for, I think, harder drugs to kind of enter the picture. I think along with what I shared is like my need to like numb and feel good about myself. That was a bad combo. And I think so into my early 20s and stuff, I think that was a big problem. And that moral compass I spoke of earlier, it started shrinking a little bit, for sure. And I wasn't really aware of it, Mark. You know, wouldn't call myself an addict, but I knew in my heart that I was different than other people. Like when other people would stop using, why did I have to like keep the party going till the break of dawn? Like it had a darker feeling into my early 20s. Whereas before it felt like I was like part of the party and there was people involved. This became sneakier, like me trying to hide it from people. And it just really created a real dark kind of, experience for me. And, you know, and really, um, pro really left me kind of what I would say spiritually bankrupt, the beginnings of that.
Hmm. Okay. Spiritual bankrupt. Wow. At
Yeah.
what age were you when you felt that sense of being spiritually bankrupt?
I would say, um, probably 22 ish, after being, uh, I won't keep the story doesn't matter because I don't like to glorify the story, but I was shot and it was related to the life I was living. And, I felt, uh, I remember swearing up and down. My mom was in the hospital. She wouldn't leave my side. All the people who like don't, you never hear from, but like when you're in ICU for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, whatever it was, they start pouring in and everything else. And I remember being heavily sedated, but I swore up and down in that tiny hospital that I would change. I was I was meant for something more, and that this is not the way I wanted to be living my life, and that I didn't know what I was going to do, but I needed to do something different. And for Mark, for you, or anyone who this particular podcast needs to reach, if I could bring any of you in that room, and you could be like a fly on the wall, so to speak, you would say, that Justin, he means what he says. Look, listen to the conviction that he says it with. And I swear that I meant it. But that's the problem. There's so many facets to spirituality, which I'm sure we'll get to, but one of them is saying what you mean and meaning what you say. The problem is the addictive mind is at odds with spirituality. And addicts love to be judged on what they plan to do, on their intentions, not their actions. That's one thing I've learned. So there's plenty of times, and that hospital was really indicative of this, where in the moment, I would say something I believed, Mark, only to do the very opposite the next day, the next hour, the next week. And in that hospital, I got out, and 2 weeks later, I'm robbing someone. I have a colostomy bag at this point. Keep in mind, I'm involved in a robbery of someone else. Running away from the scene with a cane, dropping my phone. Bad prescription pill habit at the time, just total mess, total amnesia, Mark, about that kind of moment, that God moment in the hospital, where I felt that connection to something, only to kind of take my will back and say, you know what? Nope, I'm not ready.
That's deep. That is ultra deep, because you're right. We've seen people in that situation similar to where when a moment when something happens, they speak and they say the right things. They really do. And a lot of times when they say the right things, the people they're saying it to, they tend to believe or want to believe it. And sometimes people just say, okay, we'll wait and see. But a lot of times when they're speaking that, people will take it in, and they take it into heart and want to believe it. And so and I'm not sure if you probably covered this, but within that 2-week period that you released from the hospital, what spun you around so quickly with the 360 and say, you know what, that was good 2 weeks ago, it's just not good today?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think basically I had no real motivation to change. I believe that for any tortured soul, for anything they're dealing with in life, right? The addiction is a lot of the top of my conversation, because that's a big, broad topic, and it encompasses many of my shortcomings. But with anything, any struggle someone endures in life, especially struggle that's self-inflicted, which I believe most of our wounds in life are, by the way. I think the only way true change occurs is, and I was told this a long time ago, so I didn't come up with this, and neither did this person or the person before him. But the only way true change happens is, for tortured people, is when the pain of doing the same thing becomes greater than the fear of change. And that you might think you're ready, but if the fear of doing something different, anything different, right? Finding God, finding spirituality, going for a new job, whatever the hell, it could be anything. If the fear is greater than the pain, you're pretty much gonna strike out. I mean, I can pretty much I don't make a lot of guarantees, but that's something that I've learned and observed over countless of individuals. Some I've tried to help, some just from afar. And they didn't make the change until the pain became greater. So in that hospital bed, clearly, as much as I could say it was painful, having people crying over me and stuff like that, it obviously wasn't painful enough. So, because I was still too afraid to make changes. Change is scary. We like what's comfortable, even if it's misery. And, I think there's just some unfortunate souls, Mark, that unfortunately live their whole life that way. And it's torture. It's like a slow torture.
Wow. Yeah, you're really opening our eyes to a lot because that statement alone about and I was going to ask, realistically, if you can remember back then, were there something you're afraid of? Was there something that you were scared of? I get the pain and the fear analogy, but if it was just something like a stumbling block or something fearful for you at that moment to say, you know what, I've done this enough. I've seen what this is doing to my life. I've done this enough. What was there something that change was a big bundle of fear where you didn't want to change that just at that moment? Going back again, once you came out of the hospital.
Yeah, I think that I was, my biggest fear was, I think that I, I didn't, I didn't know how to stand alone. I didn't know how to, um, I would compromise my principles for the sake of validation from people. Um, and I think one of my biggest fears, I had several. I had all the main fear of success, right? Fear of expectation. The more you show, Mark, the more is expected. I think that's pretty fair. We could all agree on that. I really wasn't interested in that. You know, I I was always a glass half empty person. I don't my that was I wasn't raised that way either, by the way. My mom is the most I'd be like, "Mom, what do you mean? Like they shut the heat off like and you're praying about it." I just couldn't understand like how do you think that that's going to work? I don't get it. Like I don't things aren't good. Like what do you mean? No, we always get taken care of with what we need. I just didn't see I had never seen life that way. Um, it still is a minor struggle for me today. I'm just not nearly as negative, not nearly as much. But in that time of my life, I just think I always assume the worst. And so, the sum of all the parts, so to speak, my biggest fear, I think, was people not accepting me, uh, liking me for who I was. Um, and that showed up in many different ways, but I think that was the fear because I'll be honest, changing your life, especially with addiction, let's say, I'll keep the focus on that for now. Like that requires a lot of times when you have to stand alone. You have to take that emotional risk to stand alone and say, well, you know what? I don't need if people aren't rolling with what I'm doing to try to change, then I don't need them around me. And that's for me, speaking just from my experience, that was really, really hard for me. And I, was just so scared of doing that. And again, that stopped me from probably, that fear kept me sick, plain and simple.
Mm. Yes. I'm glad again that you're sharing. And as I said earlier, we don't know when we're speaking who's being touched, who can we really relate. And I'm glad that you're giving us the opportunity to see and hear because we may not experience some of the things you're saying that you went through, but we know others. And if anything that we know others and we probably dealt with them, it can give us a little insight to what they were going through. Because a lot of times when people are dealing with certain circumstances, they don't open up and really share what they're feeling. So we're quick to make assumptions. It's Mr. Justin, myself, Mark Elliott. We're inside Elias Loft, When Black Men Talk, and we're doing Up from the Ashes. And this young man is sharing some mighty stuff. He's going to continue on. I'm going to bring you back to, at that point, you're with the cane, you're doing a robbery, and we'll go from there.
Okay. So my life because I want to speak. So there's a lot of low points here, and I don't want to touch on all of them because I think the redemption is the more important part of the story. I, um, but I need to remember the rough times because I never want to feel like, um, that old street saying, thinking I don't want to cuss on your podcast here, but thinking what is sweet.
Oh, no, you can, man.
I always want to remember. I always want to remember. Um, I keep those times, those times when I was in the most pain, Mark. I keep them at a safe distance, but never too far from my heart. I don't. I always, because I don't ever want to forget that. So after that robbery thing, I think really what changed for me when I got into opiates. Now, I don't think the particular drugs are of that much importance to the story, and that's why I try to not focus on that part of it. But I will say this: my desperation, like that, really turned me into a monster. And it started with Oxycontin. That was a big deal at the time. That was huge, um, especially in the suburbs at that time. I mean, that was the early 2000s. And, and I'm not sure, Mark, how familiar you or your audience, how familiar you guys are in regard to that epidemic. But that's really this fentanyl and all the stuff that's all over the news now, which I'm sure everyone's heard of. That was really kickstarted in the early 2000s by that Oxycontin boom and the rise of prescription drug abuse. And, the company who created Oxycontin is a Stanford-based company, actually, Purdue Pharma. And, I've learned a lot about this over the years. They essentially knowingly, so they've had to pay $600 million fines twice. And then the FDA finally is making them pay families and states. But essentially, they knowingly misled doctors as to how addicting their product was. And that, to me, I will say this, Mark, till the day I die. I think we live in the greatest country in the world, but that's capitalism at its worst.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
and this is from 1996, I think, to 2004. They made like $6 billion or something. So I know and again, do not quote me, but this is a rough estimate just from research I've done and things I've learned about it. Because and so anyway, I was one of probably millions of people who got caught up in that. It wasn't heroin. It still met my moral compass thing because it was like prescribed, and I the dealers weren't on Park Ave in Bridgeport or going to the Hunts Point in the Bronx where I would end up later. And the Oxycontin kind of took hold, and then my addiction progressed. And when I say, see, addiction, Mark, the reason we call, and again, I don't want to sound lecturing at all, but I'm very passionate about this topic. It's become the cause of my life. So the reason the disease model of addiction that a lot of the willpower people, and listen, I think this is ignorance, but I remember like 20 years ago having basically someone say, well, Justin, I disagree with you that addiction's a disease and I didn't know how I felt then, because they were like, if you put a bag of heroin or crack in front of you or someone else and there was a gun behind you and they said, if you take that hit or you shoot that bag, well, I'm going to pull the trigger. Well, you would muster the willpower to not do it. But I'm like, and you know what my response was? Or I would be sick enough to figure out how to take the gun from you and take my chances. What do you think about that? I remember having that conversation. I can't remember who the person was, but that's not really a good, I just use that example because there are people who don't believe that it's really a disease, even though that's widely accepted these days. It wasn't 20 years ago, 30 years ago, probably so much. We should look at addiction, like take cancer, for example, right? Let's just not comparing the two literally, but addiction, like an illness like cancer and others, it's progressive, meaning it gets worse over time if untreated. It's chronic, meaning if you stop treating it, it can go away and come back again, like other illnesses, right? Addiction, if you're not constantly on top of it, years of improvement can be backtracked in an instant and fatal. And it doesn't mean that everyone with addictive tendencies is going to experience all three of the things I just said. But essentially, my disease progressed and was chronic in the sense that really from about 20 to 25, let's say, from 21 to 25 or 26, it was, well, I'll do this drug on the weekend. I'll only use this on Saturday. I won't drink beer. I won't drink liquor. I'll only drink beer. I'll only do cocaine with this person. It was always something. And I would try to like change geographic location, change girlfriends, change jobs. I was always looking for an external solution to an internal problem. And I I wish I got this years ago, but I'm right where I'm supposed to be doing this podcast with you on April 5, of 26. So it happened for a reason. But man, if I only knew what I know then, like our parents used to say. But my life took on this crazy level of unmanageability because wherever I went, there I was, Mark. And I talked about my father not being able to outrun his disease. I couldn't either. So this led to just years of just living in different places and losing jobs and really some blown opportunities, 2 blown education opportunities. And I am not the type of person who says, I lost everything because of the disease of addiction. I lost my home. I lost my family. I lost my car. I didn't lose it. I gave it away, plain and simple. That's the harsh truth. The truth is always welcome, even if it hurts. And the hurtful truth is I didn't lose it. I gave it away because I cared more about myself and finding that next one and that next escape more than I did being truthful, spending time with people and everything. And I will say this along this time. So obviously, I'm robbing, I'm stealing, I go to jail a couple times. None of that stuff is I'm living my life like I'm a man resigned to his fate at this point. That essentially, Mark, I was comfortable with just going that path of nihilism and just like living for kicks and the next high. I really didn't care about much else. But I'll tell you what, the worst thing that a guy like me in that state of mind steals, right? It's not the checkbook. It's not the credit cards. It's not your safety if I'm putting a gun to your ribs. It's none of that. You know what it is? It's time. It's time. Time is the only thing that I stole from people and myself that I can never get back. And the other stuff, realistically, you can pay someone back, right? You can, now, not everyone will accept your apologies, which I'll get to, but a lot of other things you can repay it. Time is gone. It's gone. And, I didn't realize that. So I burned a lot of bridges, Mark, in that area of my life, that early 20s to mid 20s. And I started to I had a real loose attachment with honesty. For any of our listeners, and Mark, we all remember the movie Scarface, probably, right? It's one of the most, excuse me, one of the most quoted movies ever. You know what my favorite scene is? I want to sum up Justin's relationship with honesty at age 25, let's say. There's my favorite scene in that whole movie, very quotable movie, is when he is intoxicated and he's in the restaurant with his partner Manny and Michelle Pfeiffer and whoever, and he's with all these rich snobs and he's like the immigrant who came over and made it, and he looks at them, and this was me totally, and he says, he's accusing these people in there of being fake, not true to themselves, and he says, I always tell the truth even when I lie. And that line in that movie that was how I saw my version of the truth. Like, yes, I know I'm lying in a moment, but it's my truth. And at least I'm not being phony like all you people who like run around pretending to be good and be this a hypocrite. Like essentially saying, Mark, that I was comfortable being that way. And um that life is not going to keep you close to people. And I burned a lot of bridges. I lost really, especially two good women in particular, because here's the thing: God puts people in our life, I think, for many reasons, right? But oftentimes there's people that are put to help us. But if we're too self-absorbed and self-centered, that's at the core of addiction, self-centeredness, right? And being self-absorbed, we have blinders on and we can't see those people, even though their hands are out. And there was two women in particular. And one of them broke up with me and along this time, and she had actually gotten pregnant, and she was a college student. My work took me. Remember, I told you I tried to change geographic locations.
Mm-hmm.
I met her in Boston. I spent some time up there. I had this job delivering pool tables all over the country. And it was a perfect job for an addict. It was sporadic. It'd be months at a time. I have company credit cards. The boss was crazy. A partier himself, but not like me. And he was interesting. But anyway, I had this relationship, and this woman was in graduate school and she got pregnant. And I showed up high to meet her to talk about whether she was going to keep the baby or not, because I was deteriorating. Now, and Mark, you've heard the term functioning alcoholic, I'm sure, right? Or functioning addict or something, right? I think a lot of your listeners have probably heard that term too. That's a BS term to me, because you know what that means to me? Functioning just means like how much does your money or your career or your lot in society, how much does that hide what's really going on? How well can you lie to people? Functioning because you can pay bills, because you're not holding a sign at the end of a highway ramp. Like functioning to me is like you can be physically present but spiritually dead on arrival. So I thought I was functioning then. And I remember meeting her at a park near Boston College. And I could not fathom why she was so upset that I showed up high to meet with her, to have such a serious, life-changing discussion. And I bring that example up because that's how unmanageable and really unwell I was in my head. And I was, powerless really over my addiction. And at that point, I really didn't care though. I really didn't care. And so that was like, I know that was a long-winded summary, but I wanted to kind of summarize those few years, those like 5 or so years after the shooting incident, because it definitely got worse.
Yeah. No, don't think about the longness at all, man. Again, you're sharing some things about yourself that's going to resonate. So we don't look at the longness at all. Let's go from 25 to 30, and
Sure.
what happened in your life at that point?
So I let me see. At this point, I'm basically estranged from my family. I had stolen from them and my brother, and they had let me stay there. I think my mom was enabling, because despite being a therapist and knowing all this stuff, she's first and foremost mom. So I think there was a divide between my stepdad and my mom. Like my mom gave me more chances than anyone, but I think she too had kind of gotten tired of things. And at this point, so I was pretty much homeless, Mark, and you got to forgive me, and to any of your listeners, my recollection is very solid, my long-term recall, but all of those years seem like a blur. So they all seem to kind of mold together. So I sometimes I have to think about the time period, but basically from 2009 to 2016 when I got sober. So I was what, like 20, yeah, I don't know, 24, whatever I was, 24. Yeah, 24. I was basically in some state of homelessness, either in and out of drug and alcohol treatments. Um, I might find a place to crash here or there, but everyone always wants something from you. You know that. See, that's the other thing. Um, People, the more deeper into my addiction I got, probably from the age of let's say 24, 25 on, the more uh, people are just there as a means to an end. You know, there. My need for human connection felt very limited. And so, I had also started using heroin. And, so that, once I picked up that needle, and the details are not important, but I would say that, my level of desperation increased. And I found myself, my body turning against me. And it's so crazy addiction, man, during this time. So I can remember being homeless. And at this time, uh, I was in Waterbury for a lot of this, from like 2010 to 2016. And Waterbury is one of those cities that's great to kind of fall off the face of the earth. It's got, and listen, no disrespect to any Waterburyans listening. Every city has its pros and cons, but there was something very depressing, and it's like the land that time forgot there. It was very sad. And um uh, um even our other cities like New Haven, it has rough areas, right? But there's a cultural component. Hartford has like a lot of industry, rough areas. Bridgeport has the parks, and they, let's be honest, they basically have done a full court press to try to clean Bridgeport up. So like Waterbury for me was very representative of like where my like spirit was at that time. So I ended up settling there, homeless. And I can remember some mornings waking up and telling myself, like, again, like, here we go again. And I might wake up in an abandoned building somewhere and trying to convince myself to not go rob this store, or not go try to get uh dope from this person, because I robbed one. I took off with the bags from his cousin and whatever. And they'll shoot me in a second. And I remember there was there was these rare moments of clarity where my reason, whatever little bit was left was in there, would try to kick in, and I could not refuse. My hands would be tying my shoes, going to do the very thing that I was trying to tell myself I wouldn't do. And so, it was a very Groundhog Day existence. And basically, I'd wake up in the morning, Mark, and I had no idea how the day would end, where it would go, where I would wake up, would I die, and I didn't care. And man, that's one of the saddest places for a human to be. Um, and I remember one of those times in Waterbury, my mom coming to meet me. I think she had bought me a bus pass, because my family wouldn't really give me money at that point. And I had my own hustles, but I would still try. I was greedy, right? So I would still try to like prey on my aunt's heartstrings and do all that other stuff. And she had that conversation. She was in tears and she said, Justin, you know what? Uh, I'll always love you. You're my son, but there's not much I can do for you anymore. Like, so if you want to call the family, just say you're alive, that's fine. But as far as like being welcome at our home and all this stuff, like I can't do this. And it broke her heart to say this. Um, and it broke my heart standing there, but that's the problem. And I think the disease of addiction, Mark, and to any listeners, it destroys us, you know, mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. And for me, the spiritual part, everyone's experience might be a little different. The spiritual part was the last thing to go. And it's like, when when you won't answer your sister's call because you don't want her to interrupt in case you miss the dealer's call, that's a piece of your spirit dying. When you're in tears because you are trying to inject a needle in your arm and the blood got too thick because you couldn't hit a vein, and now you're wasting the product, and this is middle of February and it's freezing and you got like icicles coming out your nose, that's another part of your spirit dying. And there's so many instances like that. And then I remember there was right around Christmas time, I was by that mall out there. And I remember I was people watching. I was smoking Newports, probably a clip I found off the ground. Let's be honest. And I was watching, people watching, and it's Christmas time, right? And I'm looking at people pushing a baby stroller, and I'm like, man, all these people seem happy, and like I just want to have some place to be. Like all of them seem like they have some place to go or some place to be, and I'm just gonna do this and hustle all night, and roll myself up in a carpet in an abandoned building. And man, and I would just sit there and think, but very numb, right? That thought, like it's like that thought didn't really go to my heart. And that's really was the death of my spirit. And I think so from 25 to 24 or 23 to 30, with each year getting progressively more homeless and like worse. Like, in other words, like going from couch hopping to, this place or my car to like sleeping in a band, it got progressively worse. In 2016, so what led me to change, so I just turned 40 on December 22nd. So in February of 2016, Valentine's Day, it was cold. I ended up stealing, and in the commission of the stealing, I beat up a loss prevention officer pretty bad. And I remember they wanted to give me a robbery, but I had a record from before, which I didn't get into some of all the other stuff I had done. And I remember, so I got in trouble. So they caught me and I got arrested. And I remember going to county jail and before the withdrawals kicked in. And I was grateful to just rest. That's how bad it was. I was running so hard that just to be forced into nothingness, which jail is, I was sort of grateful for that. And then, I really experienced some of the worst withdrawals I'd ever had, probably from a physical standpoint. So my spirit's dead, but now my body is completely turned against me. And for anyone who doesn't know, so alcohol and benzodiazepines, those are your prescription anxiety meds like Valium, Klonopin, Xanax. Alcohol and benzodiazepines, those are the only withdrawals that can kill you, that you'll actually die from, really. Opiate withdrawal feels like you're dying. It really does. It's like if you imagine the worst flu, or if any of you had COVID, and depending on how bad your opiate habit is, multiply that times 100, and that's how it is. But if you can weather the storm, it's not going to actually kill you. But you feel like dying. And I remember I was in really, really rough shape. And in jail, they don't give you anything. They'll give you Tylenol and say, go on your way. You know what I mean? They're pretty, whatever. They're pretty rough on that front. And I remember just really having a hard time there. And this was the first time I had been in jail and I had no one to call. No one. Right? Because in my other jail stays, and I did a few years one time and 6 months here and 9 months here, I always had someone I could hang on to, right? An ex-girlfriend I can manipulate, a family member that I told them I was going to be different and a changed man. And, I never, they lived to regret it. Those people who I let down again. This time, nobody. Me, myself, and I, like De La Soul said back in the day, that was me. and it was a very harrowing experience. And so now I'm looking at 5 to 7 years because of my record, and I was on probation, and I had violated it twice. And so I remember I I kind of was withdrawn bad for like a couple weeks, and like I could feel it in my bones. Like that's how bad my body was hurting. And I remember one night, and remember how I talked about a while back, God putting people in your life and you don't even realize it, right?
Hmm.
So I was in general population. When you're withdrawing or in some type of mental despair, they put you in this unit in county jail, separate from the rest of the population. They slide your tray under the thing. It's almost like a segregation, but not quite as like meant to be a punishment. Um, so now I'm in general population, and there's these three young kids, and I had just turned 30 that December. So December 22nd, 2015, I had turned 30 years old. February February 14th of 2016, I was arrested. So it's probably a few weeks, probably the 27th, I think this was, February 27th. So I had been down there in for a couple 2.5 weeks already. And I'm sitting with these young boys, and they're the oldest one is probably like 23. And Mark, I swear, you know what they were talking about? So a couple of them had kids. They were discussing where they wanted to be when they were 30 years old. And all of a sudden, like I keep in mind, I had several of these, I call them God moments, when God, God has thrown pebbles my way to get me to see a like sort of important message, rocks my way to get me to see a real important message. And I always say boulders. He drops a boulder on me when he needs me to get the point, get the picture, the full picture. And I was sitting there, and this was a boulder moment. And I said, Justin, you're 30 years old, and this is all you have to show. You're 30 years old. These kids are talking about when they're your age, when they're going to be your age. And what are you doing? And you're sitting in lockup, and not to have a negative reflection, but it is what it is. You're listening to these young kids talk about these grandiose things and what rapper makes the most money, and you burned your family bridges, you burned it all to the ground, and you're okay with this. And I had this conversation with myself, and the next day, February 28th of 2016, I've been sober actually ever since. Now, but when I say sober or clean, as I say, I mean that really means abstinent from all mood or mind altering substances. The journey to spirituality, to rediscovering, no, to evolving my spirituality, which was dead. I'm not going to say it was non-existent in the past. We all have spirits, but it was dead. That began to me getting arrested. And really, that's a moment that stands out to me. Now, I will say this. I do not believe prison as a institution rehabilitates people. I've never believed it. I never will believe it. Are they better at offering services than 30 years ago or 50 years ago? Naturally. I think that's fair to say. But I give credit. What I'm grateful to prison for is sometimes God saves us from ourselves by making certain things kind of align to happen, right? Like it could be someone ending a bad relationship, right? That we didn't have the fortitude to end. It could be the law putting a stop to you. Like in this case, what happened to me, because honestly, Mark, I wasn't ready to stop then. Like if my crime spree continued, I could have been found dead, in a back alley somewhere, So I think I'm grateful for prison being that place where all you have is your own thoughts. And if the pain gets great enough, like I spoke on earlier, you really can put the steps to change by not being out in your same environment. Now, drugs, you can get drugs in jail. I disagree with people who say it's easier to get drugs in jail than in the street. People will say that, and sometimes the people that say that, I question perhaps they've never been to prison. You need to have connections, and a lot of things have to go right. So it's not easier. They do exist there for sure. Um, but the point is, I still was not in my normal environment. Like I was forcibly removed from the day to day that I was used to. And I had a lot of time to reflect. And I was offered a program at that time. So Governor Malloy, um, not one of our most popular governors, we could say, but one thing from a social standpoint, one thing he did do, Mark, is he started this program, and I might butcher some of the details. It's called the Second Chance Society. So Governor Malloy's son had a bad addiction, which I believe he was part of that prescription drug epidemic that I spoke of at the beginning, or middle part of this podcast. So politicians are very human in that they often will not try to elicit change until something affects them directly, right? And that's not the fault of politicians. I think that's that's part of the selfish part of being a human, I think, is like we don't always have the empathy until it hits home. And he went to prisons in like Switzerland and Europe, and he was fascinated by how much they treated addiction and mental health struggles in compared to the US. They weren't all mixed in a cage like how here, like you could commit a violent crime that's strictly related to your substance use and be in with someone who really is just a menace to society. And they might have mental health issues too, but like let's say they don't have a substance issue, they're just a violent person or whatever. I'm just using that as an example. So he wanted to separate those individuals and try to get more people. And listen, I don't think it started Malloy. Just to be clear, there's been so many grassroots organizations from a city level and an urban level that have brought attention to this. But what I'm saying is to get someone in a position of power to act, it has to hit them personally, I believe, too often, let's say. So there was a court liaison type person from one of the programs in Connecticut. And keep in mind, I had been to treatment probably 6 or 7 times before. But, it didn't do anything. I wasn't ready to change. And I remember saying to her, the most honest thing I had said in a decade, and that was, I don't even know if I am ready to stop, but I need help and I can't do it alone. And I said something to that effect. I might be paraphrasing. And that was the most honest thing I had said to another human in probably years, Mark. You're talking about, I'm that guy that would steal your wallet and help you look for it, So for me, that was a real honest moment. And about 6 weeks later, they woke me up one morning and they go, you have to go to court. And I'm thinking, oh, here we go. They're going to serve me other arrest warrants at court. Because I didn't even remember all the crazy stuff I did. Seriously. I would go on these binges in other states and like New Jersey. I didn't even get into all that. Newark and Patterson and the Bronx and all those stomping grounds. And I'm like, okay, are all these other jurisdictions going to come crashing down on me now? But I was like, you know what? It is what it is. What am I going to do now? I can't. It's out of my hands. And I went to court, and it was none of that. That woman that came to see me, who basically was a court liaison connected with a mental health facility, she was sitting there, or she came to visit me in the cell, in the courtroom, in the courthouse. And she offered me this program, and I was not sure. This is how ill I was. I still did not, I wasn't sure that I wanted to stop using drugs. And I thought about it and I decided you know what, I'll try it. And then it's probably not going to work for me because nothing else has worked before. And then I'll just go back to doing what I'm doing. What else, what am I going to do? So I didn't want to be on probation, right? A lot of people will say, in jail terms, give me the full sentence. I don't want parole. I don't want probation. That's a trap. And to be honest, it kind of is. And that's a whole nother topic for another day. But let's talk about for the individual person, parole or probation can be good for being held accountable. But as a systematic thing, I mean, look at our recidivism rate in this country. It's higher than anywhere in the world. Obviously, something needs to be fixed. But most people want to do their time because they don't want to have to like be accountable to the court system. And I was no different. But in this case, I was like, you know what? I know there's going to be lengthy probation, but I'm going to just go for it. And that continued my journey. And, you know, I went to this state-run facility in New Haven. And again, God put people in my life for a reason. Ron was my counselor there. He was awesome. You know, I connected with him on a deep level. Ron was a blues musician who used to play sax with like Shaka Khan. I've seen pictures. He's one of those Harlem Nights. I say that joke like old school. He was a heroin addict, but from that time in Harlem, you know, 70s, Nicky Barnes and all them, like that's the vibe I kind of got from him. You know, he'd have the gaiters and he always dressed like he was going to a night at the Apollo. You know what I'm saying? You know what I mean? So, but and a great guy, like really, really compassionate, raw. And I met him and he challenged me right away. Nicole is a woman. She's a godsend. She was the clinical director at this program. I started honest therapy with her for the first time because I believed in therapy. I told you guys my mom was a therapist, but therapy only works based on how honest you are. You know, if you're situationally honest, you're only as honest as the situation calls for, you're never going to get anything out of it. And Nicole, I've been working with her for the past 10 years almost. Ever since then, I never stopped. You know, she left that program to focus on her private practice, and I reconnected with her once I got out. So, like, these are people that had a deep, profound impact on me, really because they loved me until I could love myself. And, yeah, Mark, you know, I know I've been going on for a while. You
No,
can
no, man,
direct me
I
if you
appreciate
have.
it.
Oh,
I didn't want to interrupt because, yeah, you were touching on so many fine points. But, I
mhm.
mean, it rolls right into redemption. No, I'll keep going, man. No, you're right there. Right there.
Yeah. So, you know, I think that for me, you know, and I found, and this is where humility came in. You know, humility is such a great teacher. You know, humility really is. Humility to me is really a one of the most important spiritual principles. So, like 12-step recovery was basically, you know, most people have heard of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is the first 12-step program. And the basic idea of the therapeutic value of one alcoholic, or as in Narcotics Anonymous, we say addict, the therapeutic value of one addict helping another is without parallel. So that's a saying. These 12-step programs were essentially based on religious and spiritual principles, right? Honesty, open-mindedness, willingness, patience, acceptance, forgiveness. I'm naming, there's probably 100 of them, if not more. So it's nothing new. It just became the way that, you know, it connected people, these 12-step programs, in a way that probably hadn't been done before. Obviously, people were isolated in their pain. And so while, you know, I think that psychiatry, religion, there's other ways that you can also find your spiritual connection. For me, I consider myself to be more of a spiritual than religious person. I'll give you two sayings that were described to me of the difference between spirituality and religion. One person said, actually it was Ron, the counselor, the blues musician from the facility in New Haven. He said, Justin, look at religion from the outside in and spirituality from the inside out. Neither are bad. It doesn't make like one's better than the other, but look at like as a general, easy layman's way, so to speak, to look at it. And he also said, actually, this wasn't Ron. This next quote came from someone else, that religion is for people who are trying to avoid going to hell, and spirituality is for people who've already been there. And that was very profound to me. And again, I don't want to compare the two, but they are different. And I would say my path has been more spiritual. Now, so when I got into this 12-step meeting thing, the first thing was to be humbled, right? I had no license, right? My license was suspended. That's a crazy story I won't get into over your over your airwaves. But I was living in a sober house, and it was very it was like, there was bed bugs and people using crack, and it was the type of kind of slumlord situation where you'd go to this woman and tell her about the bed bugs, and she'd give you Raid spray and a Bible, and say, oh, that'll take care of them. And it's like, no, you need an exterminator. But I say that jokingly, but here's the thing about humility is, not to me, the basic premise of humility is it's not all about Justin, and it's having a right-sized image of yourself, not a grandiose, self-centered image. So there were some times in early recovery, living in the sober house, going to these 12-step meetings in the New Haven area, when I felt sorry for myself a little bit. And the humility piece was, Justin, you made decisions that got you to this point where now your world is shrunk and you're not able to, you don't necessarily have control of where you live so much or where you have to go. And you can either accept that or go do what you always did, basically. And I had to learn that early on. And a big thing with the meetings is taking commitments, right? Every meeting has like a door greeter, someone who hugs people coming in the room, a coffee maker, someone who arrives to the church like a half hour early to make coffee for the whole meeting. There's all these different commitments. The point of commitments, honestly, there's many points, but for me, it was showing up selflessly for people, even if it's simple for a cup of coffee. If you hug someone coming in the room, what if it's an addict who's just off the street who hasn't hugged anything except for the toilet bowl, when they're sick or hurting, so I didn't understand that premise of how does helping somebody else in turn help me. That was a foreign concept to me. So I really learned that rather quickly through going to meetings, and it was just consistency. So when I talk about a higher power, that's what we all talk about in 12-step recovery. My higher power, I believe in God, right? But it's a God of my understanding, right? It's not the punishing God of the Catholicism and my father's, some of his side of the family, right? It's not necessarily because I'm just saying, and I don't want to call out denominations, but I'm just talking about my personal experience, where even some of the Baptist stuff was like, well, how much you give is indicative of how much you care. No, that's not true. And I have my own understanding of my own higher power that's loving and caring, and I had to develop that. And that involves giving up your will. So I'm just kind of summing up some of my early lessons in recovery. There's so many, I could talk about this for hours, but I'm trying to sum up the important pieces. I think, what is will? What is self-will? For me, the definition that I've come to accept from my personal experience on this recovery journey, Mark, is my will is my attempt to control an outcome I have no business trying to control. And so certain things in life, you need willpower to like get up and be disciplined. Willpower is not inherently bad, but where it toes the line is when I'm trying to control everything. I'm trying to impose my will to change an outcome, usually another human being. That's usually what it involves. Specifically significant others, but it could be family members or anybody, an employee, a boss. I'm trying to force my will. I'm trying to say, well, if I can get them to see it my way. I can change this person. I can get them to do this. And in all reality, I had to learn the hard way. You could do everything in life, quote unquote, right. Uh, but like my grandma always used to say, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. It might not matter that I do everything right. The outcome might not be what I thought. So recognizing what can you control, Justin, has really, and it still is just, now that's a day-to-day struggle, but I'm getting better. That provided me some relief because there were times early on in recovery that my connection with my higher power was not where it should have been, Mark, because I would say I was like, let's say, giving up my will, and then only to engage in a ridiculous behavior that proved otherwise. That was like the opposite of how I was trying to live. And so it was difficult for me. And I met my ex, I've told you about her, Mark. Her and I might still very well end up together again. But my partner through this journey, who comes from a past like myself, and I met her probably at one of these meetings, and we just kind of dove into a relationship really fast. And I had, she had 3 kids from a previous marriage. The ex-husband was also a former addict. He has no interest in being a better person. And I don't like to judge people, but that's clear as day from his character. So while he may be physically abstinent from substances, he has no drive to be a better person. And you can live a miserable life that way, so I didn't want that, and I don't want that. You can be abstinent from a drug or a behavior, but still have the same mindset that caused the problem. And that's not a way to live. So, I was going to meetings. I was in an apartment. I was also working a very minimum wage job, menial job at a tire warehouse, slinging tires. And when I mean a sweatshop, like I'm talking about unloading with a pallet jack, Mark, by hand, like 2,600 tires. And then if you don't finish it at a certain amount of time, they send you home. Like it was through a temp agency. I tried to get my past jobs back. Nope, Justin, we don't trust you. We're not taking you back. And that's the humility.
Yeah.
Justin, you're not that important that you think you can burn a bridge and walk in with your charm and just get back what you always had. It's not going to work this time. And I needed that, and I remember I had to take the bus everywhere. Keep in mind, I had no license, as I said. So I would take the bus to work, to meetings. One time I remember it was raining. It was straight out of a movie. I was like running to catch the bus. And there was this mean bus driver. So he looked like Carl Winslow from Family Matters, right? But he wasn't chill like Carl. Like if you would like took too long to put the dollar in, he was just a miserable person, like always talking junk. And he would leave you if you were like, if he was lifting the bus, whatever that lift is, that lifts the shocks up before it takes off, and you weren't right in front of the door, he was leaving you. And I remember one day he left me, and I had to wait another hour and 20 minutes for the next bus. And I felt really sorry for myself. And I called my sponsor, a sponsor in recovery, to anybody who doesn't know, is someone who is a spiritual guide to kind of guide you through the 12 steps. When we talk about 12-step programs, the steps are put in order to guide you to what essentially amounts to a spiritual awakening. And you're constantly evolving. So you don't do the steps one time and forget about them. You live the steps in your life. Many people are familiar with, I admitted I was powerless over my addiction, that my life was unmanageable, right? Well, there's other things in our lives we're powerless over other than addiction, as an example, right? Came to believe in a higher power, right? Your relationship evolves with a higher power. Made amends to people. That's step 9. The steps are in order for a reason. And there's no time limit on them. There's no expiration date. A sponsor is someone who guides you through the process, as someone who's been through them themselves. And some sponsors are closer than others. I sponsor guys, probably 5 or 6, that I'm trying to take through the steps now. But anyway, my first sponsor, Dennis, he's actually a minister. He moved to up by Manchester because of his job. I called him after Carl Winslow, the bus driver, left me hanging in the rain, and I was really angry. I said, "This is stupid. Why did I do all this? I'm standing here in the rain. I'm going to meetings, but it's like I still feel the same." And he said, "Justin, well, you're on the line with someone who cares about you." And he was talking about my ex at the time, and he says, "And you're going to meet her at the meeting tonight, and both hear messages of hope or give messages of hope by you just showing up there. Where were you at?" At this point, I had maybe a year clean. He was like, "Where were you at a year and a half ago?" Justin, if you think like this is bad, I understand you're having a bad day, but you have a lot to be grateful for, my friend. Just please remember that. And then he hung up. He had this gravitas where he would make a brilliant point and
I
hang
like
up.
that.
And
Yeah.
oh my God. And so that is an example of some of the early stuff that I was kind of dealing with. And I was trying to navigate this relationship and really start my life at 30 years old from scratch. No savings, no real experience with like money or like how to have healthy relationships. So I grew up essentially in this 12-step program and by really getting connected with a higher power.
Here's what we're going to do, because you just spoke of where you were at 30. We're going to move it from 30 to 40 to show where you were at 30 and where you are at 39, 40.
Okay, excellent. So, so 10 years in, wow. So I completed the first round of the 12 steps, and that involved a lot of really deep introspection, and but I was pretty willing. And I will tell you this, willingness of the spiritual principles. Remember, I named some of them: forgiveness, open-mindedness, acceptance, honesty. The most important one to me, if you said, "Justin, you can only take one with you," I believe it's willingness. Who cares how honest you are, Mark, if you're not willing to do anything about it? You know what I mean? You need willingness is really everything. So, obviously, as I got clean, I was always worried up until now, as far as like, maintaining abstinence and being clean. And I will hear people talk about chronic relapsing, right? Like, that's a medical term for a person who always relapses and starts using drugs again after a period of doing well. And they've used that as a BS medical term. And to me, it's chronic unwillingness. And I remember saying that. I work in the field now, Mark. So I remember saying that in a call with a adolescent's parents, that there's always something your daughter's unwilling to do. And that's why she finds herself in these situations. So I have to practice that on my own advice. So at 40 now, really, I've come full circle in a lot of ways. I would say my biggest strengths are I'm quicker to take action. Like you know what my there's a gentleman my other sponsor, my second sponsor, who I've been working with for years now. He always used to say, "Mark, well, Justin, if you're complaining about things that you can make a realistic first step to change, what you're really telling me is it's not that bad." Like if you're someone, and he's so right, if you're someone who just complains and complains and complains and never takes an initial step, what you're really saying is, I just want someone to complain to. And I've had to remember that, because I'm someone who is always scared. Every time I make a decision, Mark, I'm always wondering what the other decision was. Like that famous poem from Robert Frost. I love poetry and writing. That's a big, academically, that's my strongest academic suit, and creatively. And Robert Frost, that poem, The Road Not Taken, where it's one of the most famous poems probably in literature. And those last lines, like, "I took the road less traveled by, and that has made all the difference." I'm just paraphrasing to move it along. But the premise of that poem is about a person who can't make choices because they're always wondering what the other decision was as soon as they make the choice they were comfortable with. And that was kind of me for the longest. And I've really gotten now, Mark, to really grow to realize that as long as the only bad choice I can make at 40 now is if I make a decision and I know or have some good idea that I'm going to have to step over or step on someone or harm myself or others to get to where that decision I wanted to lead me. If that's the only bad quote unquote decision, if I make a choice, Mark, and the outcome is not what I expected, that doesn't necessarily mean it was a bad decision. It might not be that time. I think my honesty is to a point now where I really stay ahead of myself. I don't keep secrets anymore. Secrets keep us sick. And I think I tell on myself when I'm really thinking of engaging, because again, addiction's not just about substances. It could be lust. That can be an issue for me sometimes. Just like being a workaholic, being an exerciseaholic, whatever you want to call it. I still have the tendencies to drift into things that make me feel good, but I have a strong enough connection with my higher power that I know before I get out of control, Justin, and I'll have conversations with my higher power in the car. I'll talk to the God of my understanding to the point where if this was 1996 and there was no Bluetooth and people would be like, who's this crazy person talking to himself? I mean, I have that understanding where, I think I'm able to be proactive these days, Mark, and not so reactive. So the mistakes that I do make, because I'm not perfect, no human is, they're not self-sabotaging to the point of self-destruction. That's the biggest difference now at 40. So I have 10 years clean, and I still go to 3 12-step meetings a week. The second Monday of every month, I bring a Narcotics Anonymous meeting into Garner Correctional Facility. That's actually in Newtown, strangely enough. That's one of our state prisons. And the second Wednesday of the month, I go to the county jail and bring a meeting there. I have guys that I sponsor myself. I do work in the field. In 2020, I started working for a New Haven-based organization. It's a private company, mental health and addiction treatment for men and women. And then they opened an adolescent facility. And I've been a program director there for the past 2 years. I'm in school full-time online. I'm doing an accelerated program, hoping to go into social work and expand the capacity at which I can help people. I mean, this has definitely kind of become the cause of my life. I'm a creature of habit. I'm very structured because my life had such little structure that I'm very regimented. I wake up at 4:30. I run. I go to the gym. I have my time for homework, but I'm always making it a point to try to do something for somebody else. You know what someone told me, Mark? Where else I changed is when I help people now, it's not because I want something in return. And let's be honest, like I don't even want a visit from the karma police if I get pulled over. Please don't let me, God, get a ticket, a big ticket, because I held the door for this old lady or I paid for this person's groceries. It's not about that anymore. I think my giving, the difference between me at 40 versus at 30 is when I started to feel good about myself, maybe 2 years into being clean from drugs and going to therapy and giving back, I had to tell everyone who would listen about the good things I did. Part of humility, and I'm always going to circle back to humility, part of humility and being a man of integrity is, number one, doing the right thing when no one's looking. When you know you can get away with something, what do you do then? It's easy to get up there. I don't care if you're a minister, a preacher, someone like me speaking in front of a large population at a jail or on your podcast. it's easy to talk a good game, but what do you do really in your life that's between you and your higher power when no one's watching? That's part one. Part two is when I give today, someone told me a long time ago, Justin, when you give, don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. Keep it to yourself. You give money to the homeless guy on the street, you do something kind for someone, I don't care what it is, even if it doesn't have anything to do with money, don't say anything. Keep that between you and your higher power, and you'll build self-esteem that way. And you want to build self-esteem, Mark, you do esteemable acts. And that is really because my self-esteem still needs to grow. I still doubt myself. I don't always like the man in the mirror. But I'm learning to love that person. And yeah, I think I want to try to help and touch as many people as I can. Because like I said, this way I don't have to die of waste with a needle in my arm. You know, I can say that I made people feel good. Like I think Maya Angelou said that, right?
Mm-hmm.
About people will always remember how you make them feel more than like what you bought for them, what you did for them, how, it's how you make them feel. And that became important to me. So I think now that's kind of where I'm at these days.
I said earlier, also a man of awesome character. And I'm glad we went through everything you spoke of. And that's when I said come to from 30 to 40, because redemption is there. It's there. And I'm listening to you again, this up from the ashes. Look at God. Look at you now. Look at all you've been through. You said he was throwing you pebbles. He was throwing you stones. He was throwing you boulders. He was always there.
Mm-hmm.
But look where he's brought you. Look at the people you're helping now. Look, based on what you've been through, others are benefiting from it. And who would have thought that maybe 20 years ago? And who would have thought maybe 20 years ago you're going to turn this around to where you're a benefit to others? And realistically, man, that's the beauty of it. That's the beauty. Because sometimes when people are doing certain things, maybe some of the things that you have done, we tend to give up on them. We think they have nothing to offer.
Yes.
We believe that they're, there's nothing to benefit and to be gained. And I understand why your family had to pull back away from it. And I'm happy that they did, because it helped in the long run. It helped you. You were like, yeah, we know what to turn to.
It did.
But when we realize that we all have something, God uses all of us in certain ways. It's just, and it's his time. And his time came for you. Mm-hmm. And you're doing an awesome job now, man. An awesome job.
Thank you. And it's an honor. And I really feel like, if I could sum up my relationship with a higher power before we end, there's that guy, that counselor, Ron, he had this bulletin board with all these different quotes, and one really stuck out to me. And this is not just for higher power. This speaks to connection, to one person helping another, and how that just continues. And it said something to the effect, I don't know who said this quote, but it said, even on our best days, we may be weaker than we ever knew, but we're more loved than we ever had hoped. And that always struck a deep chord with me, because it's true. I can't do this alone. And that's why I continue to try to give back. And I fall short, Mark. I fall short. There's some days I think shallow thoughts, or I don't treat someone the way I think I should have treated them. There's some nights after getting up at 4 and working a 10-hour or 12-hour day in the addiction field, where the disease of addiction is alive and well, right? It's not the best part of it. It's probably the disease at its worst, where the lower power says, Justin, go home. Get someone to cover your speaking commitment at the jail. They don't care. They don't want to listen. They're not interested in changing. It's the same people you saw there last year. Obviously, they didn't get it. And I know that's some form of lower power. And that's the time when I need to connect even more. It's like at those moments, I'm like, maybe I'm the reason that I have all this. And I don't mean stuff material, but I have all these gifts. Maybe, because that's what the lower power or force or whatever you believe in, that's what it wants us to think. This is all because of me. I'm the great I am. And the more away from that mindset I can stay, Mark, the better off I'll be, from now on. So,
Amen.
I just feel very grateful to be
I'm
here.
grateful that you came and shared, boss. Really, I am, man. I am. We usually, do things in a 60-minute format, but your story wasn't. Yeah,
Yep.
your story. We wasn't going to compress it. We were not going to press, you into 60 minutes. You needed, more time to really share and basically give detail, because again.
And I'm very long-winded,
No,
Mark.
but
I apologize. I get
please
that
do
from
not.
my father and
Please not apologize.
my mom can
No,
talk you to
please.
death
No.
too.
I'm happy
Okay.
that I'm happy that you are, man, because there's so much in the detail of what you spoke of. And as I said earlier, you basically, for those that maybe didn't travel that road, you open our eyes to certain things that of people that are traveling that road. And at the same time, you don't
Yep.
know who that's traveling, that's going down that road, that may hit the play button on this, that may connect with what you're saying, understand, and see the way you came out of it. See the way God brought you out of it. When they think there's no way possible, and they think that he's not around, they think that he's not touching them and throwing them rocks or pebbles. When they hear you speak of that, what it's going to say to them. And to me, there's nothing better than that. So don't think about the long-winded, think about none of that, man. Think the mere fact that when you open your mouth and you speak, realize he's helping you to say those words. He's bringing forth that for you to do
Yep.
his work. And I'm being honest, man. When I met you, I would have thought none of this stuff, went on in your life. I would have had no clue none of this stuff went in your life. And it changed nothing about how I feel about you. It just shows me a stronger man that you are. Because, any man can puff his chest out and act like he's strong, but it's our trials and tribulations that we learn from and stand tall with. So keep that in mind, boss.
No
keep
question.
that in mind.
Well, I appreciate you, Mark, and thank you for
Hey,
having
no problem,
me on.
man. Hold tight for a second. I'm gonna close the door on this. It's When Black Men Talk. Mark Elliott. I want to thank Mr. Justin for stopping by as we did Up from the Ashes. We get together real soon, folks. God loves you and I love you too. Take care of yourself.